정상 속도보다 빠르게 혹은 정상 속도보다 아주 느리게 들어보면 그 내용을 파악하기는 쉽지 않지만 오히려 그 언어의 고유한 억양과 소리에 더 예민해지기 때문에 더 쉽게 익숙해질 수도 있다고 하네요. 억지로 해석하지 말고 한번 편안하게 소리에 집중해 보시기 바랍니다.
My research team and I went to West Point Military Academy. We tried to predict which cadets would stay in military training and which would drop out. We went to the National Spelling Bee and tried to predict which children would advance farthest in competition. My research team and I went to West Point Military Academy. We tried to predict which cadets would stay in military training and which would drop out. We went to the National Spelling Bee and tried to predict which children would advance farthest in competition. My research team and I went to West Point Military Academy. We tried to predict which cadets would stay in military training and which would drop out. We went to the National Spelling Bee and tried to predict which children would advance farthest in competition.
복잡한 문법이 아니라 간단한 원칙으로 영어 문장의 구조와 의미를 간단하게 파악하는 데 집중해서요. 영어 문장 구조가 결국에 이런 거구나 라고 느낄 수 있도록 연습해 봅니다. 자, 고유명사가 좀 보이네요. 육군사관학교 웨스트 포인트 밀리터리 어카데미, 그리고 생도, 사관생도를 의미하는 cadet, 이런 단어들이 보여서 그렇지 동사만 보면요. 동사만 보면 역시 저희한테 굉장히 익숙하고 쉬운 동사들로 표현되고 있구나라는 것을 알 수 있습니다. 다만 advance, 저희가 보통 명사 단어로 알고 있는 진군, 발전, 뭐 이런 단어로 알고 있는 이 advance란 단어가 앞에 would, 조동사랑 같이 쓰였죠. would advance, would advance. 자, 그렇다면 뭐죠? advance란 단어가 동사로도 사용될 수 있는 단어구나 라는 것을 이 구조를 보고 저희가 짐작할 수 있습니다. 자, went to 어딜 찾아갔던 거죠? West Point Military Academy, 육군사관학교도 찾아가고 National Spelling Bee, 전국 맞춤법 철자 대회에도 찾아갔었네요. 그래서 try to predict, 예측해 보려고 했어요. drop out, 누가 탈락하는지, 그리고 또 try to predict, 예측해 보려고 했던 거죠. 어떤 아이들이 would advance, 더 높은 단계까지 진출하는지. 자, 문장의 구조가 굉장히 짜임새가 있고 전달력이 강하네요. 그렇죠? 자, 첫 번째 문장에서는 뿌리 동사가 went였고요. My research team and I, 저희 연구팀과 제가 went to, 방문했습니다. 찾아갔습니다. West Point Military Academy, 육군사관학교도 찾아가고, 그리고 we try to predict, tried, 이게 뿌리 동사고요. predict, 예측하다라는 동사가 to를 달고 변시했죠. 자, 그리고 뒤에 which라는 단어가 나왔는데요. 문장 중에 which라는 단어가 보이면은 무조건 관계대명사일 거라고 생각하시는 분들이 많은데요. 이게 관계대명사가 되려면 앞에 뭐가 있어야 되죠? 명사가 있어야 됩니다. 먼저 나온 선행사, 명사가 있어야 돼요. 관계대명사라는 것은 그 앞에 있는 명사를 설명해 주는 거잖아요. 근데 명사가 없으니까 이거 관계대명사 아닙니다. 그럼 이 which는 뭘까요? which cadet, cadet이라는 이 명사를 설명해 주고 있어요. 어떤 생도, 어떤 사관생도. which라는 단어가 이렇게 사람을 가리키면서 사람 앞에서 한정사로 어떤 누구 이런 의미로도 쓰일 수 있습니다. 뒤에서도 나오죠. which children, 어떤 아이들이. 자, 이런 식으로 우리말에 어떤에 해당하는 which입니다. 자, we try to predict, 우리는 예측해 보려고 했어요. which cadets will stay, 어떤 사관생도가 살아남을지, stay, 머무를지. which would drop out, 어떤 생도가 탈락할지. 자, 여기서 tried가 뿌리동사, predict는 변신. 근데 뒤에 will stay라는 동사가 다시 나왔는데요. 변신하지 않고. 어떻게 이럴 수 있었을까요? 동사가 변신하지 않고 이렇게 나오려면 앞에 뭔가 숨겨줄 수 있는 접속사 같은 게 있어야 되는 거잖아요. predict 다음에 접속사 대시 생략된 거라고 보시면 됩니다. 접속사 다음에 숨어 나온 동사죠. will stay는. 그래서 that을 넣어줘도 됩니다. We try to predict that which cadet will stay, 이렇게 하셔도 상관은 없어요. 자, 다음 문장도 동일한데 went를 뿌리동사로 썼고요. 이번에는 아까는 tried를 새로운 문장에서 뿌리동사로 썼는데 이번에는 try to predict, tried를 and라는 접속사 뒤에 숨어 나온 동사로 표현했습니다. 우리는 거기에 가서 and try to predict 예측해 보려고 했어요. Which children 어떤 아이들이 would advance farthest in competition 경쟁에서 가장 멀리까지 advance 진출하는지를 한번 예측해 보려고 했습니다.
My research team and I went to West Point Military Academy. We tried to predict which cadets would stay in military training and which would drop out. We went to the National Spelling Bee and tried to predict which children would advance farthest in competition. My research team and I went to West Point Military Academy. We tried to predict which cadets would stay in military training and which would drop out. We went to the National Spelling Bee and tried to predict which children would advance farthest in competition. My research team and I went to West Point Military Academy. We tried to predict which cadets would stay in military training and which would drop out. We went to the National Spelling Bee and tried to predict which children would advance farthest in competition.
하루에 짧게 일부분만 집중해서 공부를 하고 대신에 매일 하루에 한 번씩 전체를 처음부터 끝까지 다 들어보고 다음 날에 이어서 일부분을 다시 집중해서 공부를 하고 영상 전체를 다 들어보고 자 이렇게 영상 하나를 다 보고 나면 뭔가 달라지겠죠? 자 일부분을 집중해서 공부를 해봤으니까요 이제 전체 영상을 한번 편안하게 들어보세요.
When I was 27 years old, I left a very demanding job in management consulting for a job that was even more demanding, teaching. I went to teach 7th graders math in the New York City public schools. And like any teacher, I made quizzes and tests, I gave out homework assignments. When the work came back, I calculated grades. What struck me was that IQ was not the only difference between my best and my worst students. Some of my strongest performers did not have stratospheric IQ scores. Some of my smartest kids weren't doing so well. And that got me thinking. The kinds of things you need to learn in 7th grade math, sure, they're hard. Ratios, decimals, the area of a parallelogram. But these concepts are not impossible. And I was firmly convinced that every one of my students could learn the material if they worked hard and long enough. After several more years of teaching, I came to the conclusion that what we need in education is a much better understanding of students and learning from a motivational perspective, from a psychological perspective. In education, the one thing we know how to measure best is IQ. But what if doing well in school and in life depends on much more than your ability to learn quickly and easily? So I left the classroom and I went to graduate school to become a psychologist. I started studying kids and adults in all kinds of super challenging settings. And in every study, my question was, who is successful here and why? My research team and I went to West Point Military Academy. We tried to predict which cadets would stay in military training and which would drop out. We went to the National Spelling Bee and tried to predict which children would advance farthest in competition. We studied rookie teachers working in really tough neighborhoods, asking which teachers are still going to be here in teaching by the end of the school year. And of those, who will be the most effective at improving learning outcomes for their students? We partnered with private companies asking which of these salespeople is going to keep their jobs and who's going to earn the most money. In all those very different contexts, one characteristic emerged as a significant predictor of success. And it wasn't social intelligence, it wasn't good looks, physical health, and it wasn't IQ. It was grit. Grit is passion and perseverance for very long-term goals. Grit is having stamina. Grit is sticking with your future, day in, day out, not just for the week, not just for the month, but for years, and working really hard to make that future a reality. Grit is living life like it's a marathon, not a sprint. A few years ago, I started studying grit in the Chicago public schools. I asked thousands of high school juniors to take grit questionnaires, and then waited around more than a year to see who would graduate. Turns out that grittier kids were significantly more likely to graduate, even when I matched them on every characteristic I could measure, things like family income, standardized achievement test scores, even how safe kids felt when they were at school. So it's not just at West Point or the National Spelling Bee that grit matters, it's also in school, especially for kids at risk for dropping out. To me, the most shocking thing about grit is how little we know, how little science knows about building it. Every day, parents and teachers ask me, how do I build grit in kids? What do I do to teach kids a solid work ethic? How do I keep them motivated for the long run? The honest answer is, I don't know. What I do know is that talent doesn't make you gritty. Our data show very clearly that there are many talented individuals who simply do not follow through on their commitments. In fact, in our data, grit is usually unrelated or even inversely related to measures of talent. So far, the best idea I've heard about building grit in kids is something called growth mindset. This is an idea developed at Stanford University by Carol Dweck, and it is the belief that the ability to learn is not fixed, that it can change with your effort. Dr. Dweck has shown that when kids read and learn about the brain and how it changes and grows in response to challenge, they're much more likely to persevere when they fail because they don't believe that failure is a permanent condition. So growth mindset is a great idea for building grit, but we need more. And that's where I'm going to end my remarks, because that's where we are. That's the work that stands before us. We need to take our best ideas, our strongest intuitions, and we need to test them. We need to measure whether we've been successful, and we have to be willing to fail, to be wrong, to start over again with lessons learned. In other words, we need to be gritty about getting our kids grittier. Thank you.
영어 문장 속에서 동사가 등장할 수 있는 방법은 딱 세 가지밖에 없습니다. 뿌리거나 뿌리가 아니면 변신 혹은 숨어서 나오는 거죠.